The moment I saw Richard Pemberton standing at my front door with his leather-bound clipboard and that smug expression, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to turn into a nightmare. "Mr. Chen, we need to discuss a serious violation on your property," he announced, not bothering with pleasantries. Richard was the vice president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, and he wore that title like a military rank. His perfectly pressed polo shirt displayed the HOA logo prominently, and his khaki pants had a crease sharp enough to cut paper. I wiped the grease from my hands with a rag. I had been working on my motorcycle in the garage, enjoying what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. "Good morning to you too, Richard. What violation are you talking about?" He flipped through papers on his clipboard with theatrical precision. "That shed in your backyard is in clear violation of Article 7, Section 3 of the Willowbrook Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. It exceeds the permitted size for auxiliary structures, and according to our records, you never submitted architectural approval forms." My shed. The weathered wooden structure had been there when I bought the property 3 years ago. It was a solid 12 by 16-foot building where I stored my lawn equipment, tools, and seasonal items. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Patterson, had used it for decades. "Richard, that shed was here long before I moved in. It's been on this property for at least 30 years. He gave me a condescending smile that made my jaw tighten. "That's irrelevant, Mr. Chen. Current property owners are responsible for ensuring compliance with all HOA regulations. I'm giving you 30 days to remove it, or the HOA will be forced to take legal action. You'll also face daily fines of $100 starting on day 31. "You can't be serious," I said, feeling heat rise in my chest. "This is ridiculous. The shed is practically part of the property's foundation at this point. I don't make the rules, Mr. Chen, I enforce them." He handed me a formal violation notice printed on official HOA letterhead. 30 days. I suggest you get started soon. Demolition and removal aren't cheap." As he walked away, I stood there holding the notice, feeling my weekend peace evaporate completely. I had dealt with Richard before over minor issues like my mailbox being the wrong shade of black, and my trash cans being visible from the street for 20 minutes past the allowed time. But this was different. This was my property, my storage, and my money he was threatening. I went inside and called my wife, Jennifer, who was at her sister's house helping with a baby shower. When I explained the situation, she was as outraged as I was. "That man has way too much time on his hands," she said. "Doesn't he have a real job? Apparently harassing homeowners is his full-time passion project," I replied, staring at the violation notice. "I need to figure out what to do about this. There's no way I'm tearing down a perfectly good shed because Richard decided to flex his authority." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and really examined the notice. It cited specific sections of the HOA rules, referenced county building codes, and included a timeline for compliance. At the bottom, Richard had signed his name with a flourish that screamed self-importance. I spent the rest of Saturday researching HOA laws in Georgia and reading through the massive binder of rules that had been provided when we purchased the house. The document was over 200 pages of regulations covering everything from fence heights to acceptable holiday decoration periods. It was designed to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics, but in practice, it often felt like a tool for busybodies to control their neighbors. Sunday morning, I walked around the shed with fresh eyes, examining every detail. The structure was solid despite its age. The wood had weathered to a silvery gray that actually looked quite charming. The roof was newer, probably replaced within the last decade. It sat on a proper concrete foundation with drainage. This wasn't some ramshackle eyesore. It was a well-maintained, functional building. That's when an idea struck me. If the shed had been here for 30 years, it predated the HOA. Willowbrook Estates had been developed in phases, and our section had been built in the late 80s. The HOA wasn't established until 1998, according to the documents I had read. That meant the shed might be grandfathered in, protected from current regulations because it existed before those regulations were created. Monday morning, I took a personal day from my job as a software engineer and drove to the Fulton County Planning and Development Office in downtown Atlanta. The building was a typical government structure, all concrete and efficiency, with fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. After waiting in line for 45 minutes, I finally reached a clerk named Patricia, a middle-aged woman with glasses on a beaded chain. "I need to find building permits for a shed on my property," I explained, providing my address. Patricia typed slowly on her computer, squinting at the screen. "Let me check our archives. Properties in that area would have records going back to the 80s if permits were properly filed." She disappeared into a back room for what felt like an eternity. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching other people come and go with their own property issues. Finally, Patricia emerged with a manila folder that looked like it had survived several decades. "Found it," she said, placing the folder on the counter. "Original building permit for an auxiliary storage structure at your address, issued March 15, 1987. Approved by the county, all inspections passed, fees paid in full." My heart raced as she opened the folder. There it was, a faded but legible permit document with blueprints attached. The shed was clearly marked with dimensions of 12 by 16 feet, exactly what stood in my backyard now. The permit holder was listed as Harold Patterson, the previous owner. "Can I get certified copies of these documents?" I asked, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. "Absolutely. That'll be $15 for the full set with certification stamps." I would have paid 100 times that. Patricia made copies, applied official stamps and signatures, and placed them in a new folder. I walked out of that building feeling like I had just won the lottery. That evening, I drafted a formal response to the HOA violation notice. I kept it professional but firm, citing the permit date, the establishment date of the HOA, and Georgia property law regarding grandfathered structures. I included copies of the certified permit documents and requested that the violation be withdrawn immediately. Tuesday morning, I hand-delivered my response to the HOA management office, which was located in a small commercial plaza near our neighborhood. The office manager, a pleasant woman named Carol who seemed embarrassed by some of the HOA's more aggressive tactics, accepted my envelope and promised it would be reviewed at the next board meeting. "Between you and me," Carol said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone, "Richard has been on a real tear lately. He's issued 17 violation notices in the past month alone." 17. What's his problem? She shrugged. "He's up for election to HOA president next quarter. I think he's trying to prove how tough he is on enforcement." Great. I was caught in the middle of HOA politics. Nothing good ever came from that. I expected a response within a few days, maybe a week. What I didn't expect was Richard showing up at my door again on Thursday evening, his face red with barely contained anger. "Mr. Chen, your so-called permit doesn't change anything," he declared, waving a copy of my response letter. "The HOA has the authority to enforce current standards regardless of when a structure was built. The shed still violates current size restrictions." "That's not how grandfathered structures work, Richard," I said, keeping my voice level despite my rising frustration. "The permit predates your HOA by over a decade. Georgia property law is clear about this. We'll see what our attorney says about that." He stepped closer, invading my personal space in what I assumed was meant to be intimidating. "I'm giving you fair warning, Mr. Chen. If that shed isn't gone in 26 days, you're going to face consequences. The HOA has significant legal resources at our disposal." "Then I guess we'll both be talking to attorneys," I replied, refusing to back down. Because I'm not destroying a legally permitted structure that's been on my property for nearly 40 years just because you decided to target it. Richard's jaw clenched. This isn't over. No, I don't think it is. After he left, I immediately called Jennifer at work to update her. She was a paralegal at a downtown law firm, and while property law wasn't her specialty, she had connections. I'll talk to David in our real estate division, she said. This is exactly the kind of case he loves. HOA overreach is one of his pet peeves. That Friday, I met with David Steinberg, a partner at Jennifer's firm who specialized in property disputes. His office had a view of the Atlanta skyline, and his walls were covered with framed victories against various homeowner associations throughout Georgia. David reviewed my documents with the intense focus of someone who genuinely enjoyed this kind of fight. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "This is beautiful," he said, tapping the certified permit. Clear documentation, proper county approval, predates the HOA by 11 years. In Georgia, grandfathered structures are protected under statutory law. The HOA can't force you to remove it. So what do? We respond with force. I'll draft a letter explaining the legal situation in terms they can't misinterpret. We'll cite the relevant statutes, include case law precedents, and make it clear that any attempt to fine or take legal action will result in a countersuit for harassment and legal fees. How much is this going to cost me? David smiled. For a case this straightforward, I'll do the initial letter for $500. If they push back and we need to take it further, we'll discuss a strategy. But honestly, most HOAs back down when they realize they're legally wrong and facing someone with proper representation. I wrote him a check, feeling both relieved and frustrated that I had to spend money to defend something I already had every right to keep. David's letter went out the following Monday via certified mail to the HOA board, Richard personally, and the HOA's registered attorney. It was 6 pages of detailed legal analysis that essentially said, "Back off or get sued." For a week, there was blissful silence. I started to hope that maybe Richard and the board had seen reason and would drop the whole matter. I should have known better. The following Thursday, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a firm called Morrison & Associates. The letter acknowledged my grandfather claim, but argued that the shed's current condition and maintenance created a separate violation under nuisance and aesthetic standards clauses in the HOA rules. They claimed the weathered appearance diminished neighborhood property values and demanded either removal or complete renovation to meet current aesthetic standards. "They're moving the goalposts," I told David over the phone, reading him the letter. "Classic HOA tactic," he replied, not sounding surprised at all. "They know they can't win on the removal demand, so they're trying to force you into expensive renovations instead. But they're on shaky ground here too. The shed is well-maintained, functional, and not visible from the street, correct? Correct. You can only see it from my backyard or from the 2 neighbors who back up to my property." "Have either of those neighbors complained?" "No. I actually spoke with both of them over the weekend. The Johnsons on the left have a similar shed, and the Martins on the right said they never even notice mine. Both think Richard is being ridiculous." "Perfect. We need written statements from them. I'll draft something simple they can sign." The HOA will have a hard time arguing aesthetic damage when the people who actually see the structure have no complaints. Over the next few days, I gathered statements from both neighbors. Tom Johnson, a retired firefighter, wrote a particularly strong one stating that my shed was actually in better condition than many newer structures in the neighborhood. Susan Martin, a teacher, noted that the shed was barely visible through the trees and hedge that separated our properties. Meanwhile, Richard wasn't done with his harassment campaign. On Saturday morning, I discovered an official HOA inspector in my backyard, taking photographs of the shed without permission. "Excuse me, what are you doing on my property?" I called out, walking across my lawn. The inspector, a nervous-looking young man with a camera, jumped slightly. I'm conducting an official HOA inspection as authorized by the CC and Articus. Property inspection rights are covered under Article 12. Article 12 covers inspection of HOA common areas and visible exterior property features from public areas, I said, having memorized that section specifically. It doesn't authorize trespassing in my backyard. You need to leave now. Mr. Pemberton sent me, he protested weakly. I don't care if the governor sent you. This is private property and you're trespassing. Leave before I call the police. He left quickly, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. I immediately took photos showing the open gate he had used to enter my backyard and the footprints in my flower bed where he had walked. I called David again. Add trespassing to the list of issues. I love angry HOA board members, David said cheerfully. They always overplay their hand. This helps our case significantly. They're showing a pattern of harassment now. The situation escalated at the next HOA board meeting, which was held on a Tuesday evening at the community center. These meetings were technically open to all homeowners, though usually only a handful of people attended. That night, I made sure to be there. The community center was a modest building with a meeting room that held about 50 people. When I arrived, there were maybe 20 homeowners present, plus the 5 board members seated at a table up front. Richard sat in the vice president's chair, looking smug. The president, a woman named Linda Kowalski who seemed perpetually exhausted by HOA drama, sat beside him. After going through routine business like landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules, Linda reached the agenda item I was waiting for. Next, we have the ongoing violation discussion regarding 4237 Maple Grove Drive, she said, looking uncomfortable. Richard, you wanted to address this. Richard stood, which was completely unnecessary but very on brand for him. Thank you, Linda. As you all know, maintaining property standards is essential to preserving our neighborhood's value and character. The shed at Mr. Chen's property represents a significant violation that has gone unaddressed for too long. He clicked a remote, and a projector screen displayed photos of my shed taken from various angles, including the ones his inspector had taken by trespassing. As you can see, this structure is weathered, outdated, and inconsistent with our community standards. Mr. Chen has refused to comply with our reasonable request for removal despite being given ample time and notice. I raised my hand. I'd like to respond to that. Linda nodded. You have the floor, Mr. Chen. I stood, holding my folder of documents. First, the shed is a grandfathered structure with a valid county permit from 1987, 11 years before this HOA existed. Second, Georgia law protects grandfathered structures from retroactive regulation. Third, the shed is well-maintained, functional, and not visible from public areas. Fourth, my adjacent neighbors have provided written statements that they have no complaints about it. And fifth, some of those photos were taken by an inspector who was trespassing on my private property without permission. I distributed copies of everything to the board members. Several of them looked surprised, clearly not having been given the full story by Richard. Board member Thomas Wright, an accountant who lived 3 streets over, studied the documents. Richard, did you know about this permit? The permit doesn't matter, Richard insisted, his face reddening. Current standards supersede old permits. That's not accurate according to Georgia property law, I said, remaining calm. And your attorney's letter attempting to shift to aesthetic violations is equally baseless. The shed is in good condition, and the people who can actually see it have no complaints. Another board member, Sandra Alvarez, spoke up. Linda, I think we need to have the HOA attorney give us a clear legal opinion on this before we proceed. It sounds like we might be exposing the HOA to liability. I agree, Linda said, looking relieved to have an out. Richard, I'm tabling this matter until we get proper legal counsel. Morrison and Associates needs to give us a full analysis. Richard looked like he wanted to explode. We're the board. We have the authority to enforce violations. And we're the board that has to approve any legal action, Thomas said firmly. I'm not voting to spend HOA funds on a lawsuit we might lose. That's homeowner money we're talking about. The meeting moved on to other topics, but Richard stared daggers at me for the rest of the evening. As people filed out afterward, several homeowners approached me to offer support. Richard did the same thing to me about my fence last year, one man said. Cost me $3,000 to fight it, and I eventually had to modify the fence even though there was nothing wrong with it. Good for you for standing up to him. A woman added, he's turned this HOA into his personal fiefdom. Someone needs to put him in his place. The support felt good, but I knew this was far from over. Richard wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Sure enough, the next morning I received an email from Richard directly, not from the HOA official account. The subject line read, "Final warning." The email was aggressive and personal in a way that crossed professional boundaries. He accused me of being a troublemaker, of showing disrespect for community standards, and of encouraging other homeowners to violate rules. He claimed my actions were undermining neighborhood cohesion and property values. The email ended with a threat that if I didn't do the right thing and remove the shed voluntarily, he would make sure I regretted it. I forwarded the email to David immediately. "Well, this is gift-trapped evidence of harassment," David said when he called me back. "Save every communication from him. We're building a case that could result in him being personally liable if this goes further." "I just want him to leave me alone," I said, frustrated. "This is taking up so much time and mental energy. I have a job and a life." "I know, but you're doing the right thing. If you back down, Richard will just target someone else, and the precedent of letting the HOA override grandfathered permits would affect everyone in your neighborhood." He was right, but that didn't make it less exhausting. 2 weeks later, the HOA's attorney provided their legal opinion to the board. I obtained a copy through a formal records request, which HOAs in Georgia are required to honor for homeowners. The opinion was clear. The shed was legally protected as a grandfathered structure, and attempting to force its removal would likely result in a losing lawsuit plus significant legal fees. The attorney recommended dropping the enforcement action. I thought that would be the end of it. The HOA had their answer from their own legal counsel. Surely even Richard would accept that. Instead, Richard convinced 2 other board members to support a new strategy. At the next board meeting, they proposed a special assessment to create a neighborhood improvement fund that would pay homeowners to voluntarily upgrade or remove older structures. The shed at my address was specifically mentioned as an example of a structure that would qualify for the program. It sounded reasonable on the surface, but the details revealed the trap. Homeowners who participated would receive up to $5,000, but they would have to sign away any grandfathered protections for structures on their property. It was essentially bribing people to give up their legal rights. "This is ridiculous," Thomas Wright said at the meeting. "We're creating a fund to solve a problem that doesn't exist except in Richard's mind. Our reserves are for emergencies and necessary maintenance, not for paying people to remove sheds that aren't bothering anyone. It's about community improvement," Richard argued, "about bringing the entire neighborhood up to current standards. It's about targeting Mr. Chen's shed," Sandra said bluntly. "Let's not pretend otherwise." The vote failed 3-2 with only Richard and 1 other member supporting it. Richard was visibly furious, his face red and his hands clenched. After the meeting, Linda approached me privately. "Mr. Chen, I want to apologize for how this has been handled. Richard has been fixated on your shed for months, and I've been trying to keep him in check, but he's relentless." "Why is he so obsessed with this?" I asked, she sighed. "Honestly, I think you challenged his authority early on and he can't let it go. Richard's entire identity is wrapped up in being the HOA enforcer. When someone successfully pushes back, it threatens his self-image." "That's not healthy," I said. "No, it's not. And between you and me, several of us are planning to vote against him in the presidential election next quarter." The neighborhood needs leadership, not dictatorship. That conversation gave me hope, but it also made me worried about what Richard might do if he felt his position was threatened. My worry was justified. The following week, I received a citation from Fulton County Code Enforcement for an alleged building code violation. Someone had filed a complaint claiming my shed was structurally unsafe and built without permits. This was clearly Richard's doing, but it still had to be taken seriously. Code enforcement had the authority to condemn structures and force demolition if they found legitimate safety issues. The inspector, a county employee named Marcus Thompson, arrived on Thursday morning. He was professional and thorough, examining the shed's foundation, framing, roof, and overall condition. He also reviewed my grandfather permit documents. "Mr. Chen, there's nothing wrong with this structure," Marcus said, making notes on his tablet. "It's actually in better shape than a lot of newer sheds I see. The complaint alleged structural instability and no permits, but I have your permit documents here and the structure is clearly sound." "So you're closing the complaint?" "Absolutely. This was a waste of county resources." "Do you know who filed it?" "I have my suspicions, but I can't prove it." Marcus nodded knowingly. "HOA dispute. How did you guess?" "Because about 30% of our complaints come from HOA conflicts where someone is weaponizing code enforcement to harass their neighbors. It's a problem." He handed me a copy of his report. "You're all clear. If you get any more complaints, just reference this inspection number. We won't keep coming out for baseless claims." After Marcus left, I called David again to update him on the latest development. "That's attempted abuse of government resources," David said. "If we can prove Richard filed that false complaint, we might be able to pursue charges. At minimum, it's more evidence of harassment." "I'm so tired of this," I admitted. "It's been months of constant stress. I spend more time dealing with HOA drama than actually enjoying my home." "I understand, but you're close to the finish line. Richard is getting desperate, which means he knows he's losing. Desperate people make mistakes. David was right about the mistakes." Richard's next move was his biggest one yet. On a Saturday morning in early June, I was awakened by loud noises coming from my backyard. I looked out the window and saw a demolition crew with a truck and equipment preparing to tear down my shed. I ran outside in my pajamas. "Stop." "What are you doing?" The foreman, a burly man with a beard, held up a work order. "We're contracted to remove this shed. Got the authorization right here from the Willowbrook Estates HOA, signed by Richard Pemberton." "That authorization is fraudulent." "This is my property and I did not approve this." The foreman looked uncertain. "Look, buddy, we just do what we're contracted to do. We got a signed order and payment. If you touch that shed, you'll be committing property destruction and I'll have you arrested," I said firmly. "This is not authorized by the property owner. Whatever Richard Pemberton told you is a lie." I pulled out my phone and called 911. "I need police assistance. Someone is attempting to destroy property on my land without authorization." That got the foreman's attention. "Hang on, let me call my boss." He stepped away to make a phone call while his crew stood around awkwardly. Within 15 minutes, 2 Fulton County police officers arrived. I explained the situation and showed them my property deed, the grandfathered permit, and the work order the demolition crew had. Officer Jennifer Hayes examined the documents carefully. "Mr. Chen is the property owner and he's clearly refusing authorization for this work. The HOA doesn't have the authority to order demolition of private property improvements without the owner's consent." She turned to the foreman. "If you proceed, you'll be criminally liable for property destruction." The foreman held up his hands. "We're not proceeding. This is above our pay grade." "We're leaving." He looked at me apologetically. "Sorry for the trouble. We were told this was an approved removal." "It's not your fault," I said, though my heart was still racing. "You were lied to." After the demolition crew left, Officer Hayes took a detailed report. "Mr. Chen, what you've described is a pattern of harassment that could potentially rise to criminal charges. The attempt to have your property demolished without consent is particularly serious. What should I do? File for a restraining order against Mr. Pemberton. Document everything. And I'd recommend pursuing criminal charges for attempted property destruction. We'll be filing our report and a detective will likely follow up. Her partner, Officer David Martinez, added, HOA disputes get out of hand sometimes, but this is beyond typical neighbor drama. This guy tried to have your property destroyed. That's not okay. After the police left, I called David Steinberg, even though it was Saturday. Richard just tried to have my shed demolished without my permission, I told him. There was a pause. He did what? I explained the entire morning's events. David listened in what I imagined was stunned silence. Okay, this just became a whole different case, he finally said. What Richard did could be criminal trespassing, attempted destruction of property, and possibly fraud if he misrepresented his authority to the demolition company. We're filing for an emergency restraining order Monday morning, and I'm recommending you pursue criminal charges. Will that actually go anywhere, with police reports and witnesses? Absolutely. Richard crossed a major line. He's going to face real consequences. I spent the rest of the weekend documenting everything, organizing every email, letter, photo, and document from the past months. Jennifer helped me create a timeline of events. What had started as a simple dispute over a shed had evolved into months of escalating harassment culminating in an attempt to destroy my property. Monday morning, David filed for an emergency protective order in Fulton County Superior Court. The petition detailed the entire conflict, emphasizing the false code enforcement complaint and the attempted demolition. By Tuesday afternoon, we had a temporary restraining order that prohibited Richard from contacting me directly, coming onto my property, or taking any action regarding my shed. The order was served to Richard at his home by a county sheriff's deputy. According to the deputy's report, Richard initially refused to accept service and insisted he had done nothing wrong as he was just enforcing HOA rules. The deputy had to explain that HOA authority did not supersede property law or authorize destruction of someone else's property. The HOA board held an emergency meeting on Wednesday evening. This time, nearly 50 homeowners showed up, having heard about the escalating situation through neighborhood gossip. The mood was tense. Linda called the meeting to order and looked exhausted. We're here to discuss the situation involving Richard Pemberton and the ongoing dispute with Mr. Chen regarding a shed at 4237 Maple Grove Drive. Richard stood immediately. This is a witch hunt. I was trying to enforce the rules that all of you agreed to when you bought in this neighborhood. You tried to have someone's property demolished without their permission, Thomas Wright said, his voice hard. That's not enforcement, that's vigilantism. The HOA has authority under the CC and Articus, Richard insisted. Sandra Alvarez shook her head. I've reviewed the CC and Articus extensively since this started. We have no authority to demolish private property improvements. We can fine, we can place liens for unpaid fines, and we can take legal action in court. We cannot order physical destruction of someone's property. What you did was illegal. A homeowner in the audience stood up. I want to know if the HOA is legally liable for what Richard did, because if we're all on the hook financially because he went rogue, that's a big problem. Linda addressed the crowd. Our insurance attorney is reviewing that question. Richard signed the demolition order personally, not as an official HOA action approved by the board. That should limit our liability, but we're still exposed if Mr. Chen decides to sue the HOA as an entity. Multiple people started talking at once, most expressing anger at Richard for putting the HOA at legal and financial risk. The meeting devolved into chaos for several minutes before Linda restored order. Here's what's going to happen, Linda said firmly. The board is voting tonight on whether to remove Richard from his position as Vice President for conduct unbecoming of a board member, and for taking unauthorized actions that expose the HOA to legal liability. You can't do that, Richard protested. I'm an elected officer. The bylaws allow removal of officers for cause with a majority vote of the board and approval from a quorum of homeowners, Thomas said. We have both here tonight. The vote was 4-0, with Richard abstaining and arguing the vote was invalid. The homeowners were then asked to vote by show of hands on approving the removal. Of the approximately 50 people present, 47 raised their hands in favor. 3 abstained. No one voted against. The motion passes, Linda declared. Richard, you're removed from the board effective immediately. Please surrender any HOA property including keys, documents, and equipment. Richard's face went through several shades of red. This is outrageous. I've dedicated years to this community, and you're throwing me out because I tried to enforce standards. You tried to demolish someone's property, Sandra said. That's not enforcement. Please leave before we call security. Richard stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The room erupted in conversation, relief evident in most voices. After the meeting, Linda approached me again. Mr. Chen, on behalf of the board, I want to formally apologize for everything you've been put through. The violation notice against your shed is hereby permanently withdrawn. You will face no fines, no further action, and no additional scrutiny. Your grandfathered shed is completely approved and accepted. Thank you, I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I appreciate that. I also want you to know that we're reviewing all 17 of the violation notices Richard issued in recent months. Several appear to be as baseless as yours was. We're trying to clean up his mess. The criminal case against Richard moved forward over the following weeks. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office assigned a prosecutor named Amanda Chen, no relation to me but a coincidence that made her smile when we met. Mr. Chen, this is a fairly straightforward case, she explained in her office. We have documented harassment, a false government complaint, and attempted destruction of property. Mr. Pemberton fraudulently represented his authority to a demolition company and arranged for the destruction of your property without consent. That's criminal trespass and attempted criminal damage to property. What kind of penalties are we looking at? In Georgia, criminal damage to property can be a misdemeanor or felony depending on the value. Your shed and its contents would likely put it in felony territory. We're offering Mr. Pemberton a plea deal. Plead guilty to misdemeanor charges, accept probation, pay restitution for your legal fees, and undergo anger management counseling. If he refuses, we go to trial on felony charges. Richard initially refused the plea deal, insisting he had done nothing wrong. His attorney, however, apparently convinced him that the evidence was overwhelming, and a jury would not be sympathetic to someone who tried to demolish a neighbor's property over an HOA dispute. In late July, Richard appeared in Fulton County Superior Court and pleaded guilty to misdemeanor criminal trespass and attempted property damage. Judge Patricia Morrison was not gentle in her comments during sentencing. Mr. Pemberton, HOA membership does not grant you authority to act as judge, jury, and executioner regarding your neighbor's property, she said sternly. You took it upon yourself to order the destruction of property that was not yours, that was legally permitted, and that you had no right to touch. This is a serious abuse of whatever authority you believed you had. She sentenced him to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management classes, and ordered him to pay $15,000 in restitution to cover my legal fees. She also issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting him from coming within 100 feet of my property or contacting me in any way. If I see you in my courtroom again for anything remotely similar, Judge Morrison concluded, you'll be spending time in jail. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Richard said quietly, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, genuine relief. It was finally over, the summer passed peacefully. The new HOA Vice President, Thomas Wright, proved to be reasonable and focused on actual community issues rather than petty enforcement. The pool got repaired, the landscaping looked great, and neighborhood events were pleasant affairs without the tension of Richard's presence. My shed remained exactly where it had been for nearly 40 years, storing my tools and equipment without bothering anyone. I did decide to give it a fresh coat of stain, not because I had to, but because the whole ordeal made me appreciate it more. Tom Johnson helped me one Saturday, and we had beers afterward while admiring our handiwork. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Tom said, looking at the shed. "It actually looks really nice now. Richard probably would have left it alone if it had looked like this when he first noticed it." "Richard would have found something else to complain about," I replied. "Some people just need a target." In September, the HOA held elections for a new president. Linda declined to run again, saying she needed a break from the stress. Thomas won in a landslide, running on a platform of common sense enforcement and community building. His first act was to establish a new policy requiring board approval before any violation notices could be issued, preventing any single person from launching harassment campaigns. Several homeowners approached me at the election meeting to thank me for standing up to Richard. Apparently, my case had inspired others to push back on questionable enforcement actions, and the board was reviewing and reversing several violations that had been improperly issued. "You changed the culture of this HOA," one woman told me. "People aren't afraid to push back anymore when something doesn't make sense." That felt good, though I never wanted to be the center of HOA drama ever again. In October, I received a check from Richard for the full $15,000 restitution amount. There was no note, no apology, just the check. I deposited it and used some of the money to take Jennifer on a long weekend trip to Charleston. We stayed in a bed and breakfast, ate amazing food, and didn't think about HOAs or sheds or Richard Pemberton even once. By November, the entire situation felt like a bizarre chapter that had closed. My life returned to normal. I worked on my software projects, rode my motorcycle on weekends, and enjoyed my home without constantly looking over my shoulder for violation notices. The shed stood solid and strong in my backyard, its fresh stain gleaming in the autumn sun. Inside, my tools were organized, my seasonal decorations were stored, and everything had its place. It was just a shed, a simple wooden structure built nearly 4 decades ago by a man who needed storage space and followed the proper legal procedures to get it. But it had become more than that. It had become a line in the sand, a test of property rights versus HOA overreach, and a reminder that standing up for yourself matters even when it's exhausting and expensive. One Saturday in early December, I was stringing Christmas lights on my house when Thomas stopped by. He had been a good HOA president, focused on actual problems and treating homeowners with respect. "Hey, I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "Richard's house went up for sale last week. He's moving out of the neighborhood." "Really?" "Yeah." I guess between the legal issues, the probation, and everyone knowing what he did, he decided to start fresh somewhere else. Can't say I blame him, but I also can't say I'm sorry to see him go. "Think he'll try to run another HOA wherever he lands?" I asked. Thomas laughed. "Probably. But that's their problem, not ours. We've got a good thing going now. People are actually enjoying living here again." As he walked away, I looked at my house, my yard, and yes, my shed. This was home, and I had fought to keep it that way. Not just the physical structure, but the principle that my property was mine, protected by law and permit and basic fairness. The Christmas season brought the usual neighborhood festivities, but they felt different this year. The tension that had hung over Willowbrook Estates was gone. People were friendlier, more relaxed. The holiday decorating contest was fun instead of stressful. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about violation notices for chalk drawings. On Christmas Eve, Jennifer and I hosted a small gathering with Tom and his wife, the Martins, and a few other neighbors. We stood in our backyard around a fire pit, drinking hot cider and talking about everything except HOAs and property disputes. "I still can't believe he tried to have it demolished," Susan Martin said, glancing at the shed. "Who does that?" "Someone who confused authority with power," Tom said. "He had a little authority and thought it made him powerful. Then he discovered that actual power, legal power, doesn't work that way. Well, here's to boring HOA boards that fix potholes and plan Easter egg hunts instead of harassing homeowners," I said, raising my cup. "I'll drink to that," everyone replied. As winter turned to spring, the neighborhood continued to thrive under reasonable management. The reserves were healthy, the common areas were maintained, and violation notices were rare and only issued for actual problems like truly abandoned vehicles or severe neglect. Richard's house sold in February to a young couple with twin toddlers. They were nice people who were just excited to have a home in a good neighborhood. I never mentioned the previous owner or the drama that had played out right next door to where they now lived. They didn't need to inherit that history. In March, almost a year after Richard first knocked on my door with his clipboard and his demands, I was working in my garage when I noticed something. The shed, which had been the center of so much conflict, was just there, just existing, just being a shed. I smiled, realizing that's all it had ever been, all it should have ever been. Later that evening, I sat on my back porch with Jennifer, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. The shed cast a long shadow across the yard, solid and permanent. "Do you ever regret fighting so hard over it?" Jennifer asked. "I know it was stressful," I thought about that. No, if I'd backed down, Richard would have just moved on to the next person, the next thing. And beyond that, it was the principle. Someone trying to take something that was legally mine, that I had every right to keep, just because they decided they didn't like it. That's not how property rights work. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. You're right. I'm proud of you for standing up to him. I couldn't have done it without David's help and yours and the neighbors' support. True, but you were the one who had to deal with Richard showing up at the door, who had to go to meetings and court dates and all of it. That took courage. I squeezed her hand. Well, it's over now. And I don't plan on getting into any more HOA battles for the rest of my life. Famous last words, she teased. We both laughed, but I meant it. The shed situation had taught me a lot about standing up for yourself, about property law, about the importance of documentation and knowing your rights. But it had also taught me that most conflicts aren't worth the energy they consume. The shed was different because it was about fundamental fairness and legal rights. Most HOA disputes probably weren't. As summer arrived again, marking more than a year since the whole ordeal began, Willowbrook Estates had fully moved on. Thomas was doing a good job as president, the board functioned smoothly, and neighborhood events were well attended and enjoyable. I added some landscaping around the shed, planting hydrangeas that Jennifer loved. The structure that had been the center of so much attention was now just a pleasant backdrop to a garden, exactly as it should be. One warm July evening, I was mowing the lawn when a new neighbor from 3 streets over approached me. He introduced himself as Marcus and said he'd heard about my situation with the previous HOA leadership. "I just wanted to say thank you," Marcus said. "I got a violation notice about my fence last month, something about it being 2 inches too tall. But when I pushed back and showed that it was installed by the previous owner in 2015 according to specs approved then, the board withdrew the notice immediately. Thomas said they'd learned their lesson about going after established structures. "I'm glad it worked out for you," I said. "It wouldn't have if you hadn't stood up to Richard. You changed how this HOA operates. That matters to all of us." After he left, I finished mowing and put my mower back in the shed, in the space where it had lived for years. The interior was organized and functional, everything in its place. My tool bench sat against one wall, shelves of paint and supplies on another. It was nothing special, just a well-used storage space. But it represented something important. The idea that homeowners have rights, that those rights are protected by law, and that standing up to bullies, even bureaucratic ones with clipboards and committee authority, matters. The sunset that evening was particularly beautiful, the kind of evening that reminded me why Jennifer and I had bought this house in the first place. Good neighborhood, solid home, enough space to breathe. The HOA drama had been a detour, an unwelcome disruption, but it was over. I stood in my backyard, looking at the shed, and felt nothing but satisfaction. It was still there, still solid, still serving its purpose. Richard was gone, the harassment was over, and life was good. Sometimes the simple act of refusing to back down, of insisting on your rights even when it's difficult, makes all the difference. Not just for yourself, but for everyone else who might face the same situation later. The shed wasn't just grandfathered in by county permit and legal precedent. It was grandfathered into the story of our neighborhood, a reminder that fairness matters and that one person standing firm can change a culture. As I walked back toward my house, I heard Tom calling over the fence. "Hey, need help moving anything heavy this weekend?" "I figure I owe you after all the help you gave me last month." "I'm good, but thanks. Maybe we can fire up the grill Saturday, have everyone over." Sounds perfect. And it was perfect. The neighborhood, the friendships, the simple pleasure of being home without stress or conflict. That's what it had all been about. Not really the shed itself, but the right to live peacefully in your own home, following the rules that existed when you bought in, without someone arbitrarily deciding to make your life difficult. The legal fees had been substantial, even with the restitution. The stress had been real. But standing in my backyard on that perfect summer evening, I knew I'd do it all again if I had to. Some things are worth fighting for, and the sanctity of your home is definitely one of them. The shed stood quiet in the fading light, just being what it had always been. A simple structure, legally built, properly permitted, and grandfather into protection. It would probably be standing there for another 40 years, long after I was gone, a silent testament to the importance of property rights and the danger of giving petty tyrants too much power. And that was exactly how it should be.